You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Vlad Tarko of Dickinson College. Vlad, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
I'm glad to be here.
So today our topic is going to be the life and work of Elinor Ostrom. She's most famous for winning the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. So Vlad, why don't we start by tell me about your work on Ostrom? What made you want to write about her and her research?
Yeah, so I first got into researching a lot about Elinor Ostrom when I first worked at a think tank in Romania, which is built on Elinor Ostrom's research and has done some research in that framework. And while I was working at that think tank in Romania, I got to meet Dragos Aligica, and then I basically started working with Dragos on all sorts of Ostrom-related stuff, especially with polycentricity. And then I basically continued expanding on polycentricity and seeing how that concept can be applied in new directions. So that's mainly my work on Elinor Ostrom related stuff. So the way I got to write the biography is basically I was recommended by Pete Betke to be the author of this, and basically they took a chance on me to write this book.
So let's define polycentricity for the listeners. My understanding, it's the idea of having governance coming from not just one central authority, but from multiple levels of authority. So like the most basic example is, national government, state government, local government, but there are other versions of it too.
Yeah, so the idea of polycentricity is that you have multiple centers that take decisions on their own, but each of them has a relatively big impact on the others. So you could have negative externalities upon the other decision makers. So then you cannot just everyone do whatever they're doing. They have to have some sort of framework to address potential conflicts. Right? So basically, you have some rules about how they are allowed to do whatever they're doing on their own. So polycentricity is related to just decentralization, but it has this supplementary idea that you have a framework of rules that kind of organizes the whole system. And one of the key elements in this research is to ask, okay, where do those rules come from? And it's often the case that it's the decision makers themselves that create and enforce these rules rather than having a third party create the rules for them. So that's kind of an important idea because, so if we're looking, say, at Elinor Ostrom's work, she's most famous for showing that communities can solve the tragedy of the commons. So how do they do that? Is by creating and enforcing certain rules, right? So it's this whole idea that you can have independent decision makers and yet they can also create rules such that their activities do not, they create a tragedy of the commons. So they can do that under certain conditions without a third party just imposing rules on them from the outside.
Yeah. So that's an idea and the study of that is a big reason why Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics. She's unusual among Nobel Prize winners for a lot of reasons. For one, she comes from a political science background. Another thing is that she's the first woman to win the Econ Nobel, and also she a lot of her work focuses on field work, right? And she's not just manipulating equations in her office somewhere. She's going out into the field and observing what happens in sort of out in the world, which is not. I think the sort of novelty of the method, at least among economists, is partly what makes her work so interesting. Do you want to speak to her background?
Yeah, so she's a political scientist, but somehow she's kind of unusual for an economist because she's coming from this political science background, but she's also unusual as a political scientist because she's very heavily influenced by economics and she's using economic tools to address various political science questions, especially about governance. Um, so it's not so unusual that she got the Nobel Prize in economics. So she was very well known in economics, in public choice, and in institutional economics, and in environmental economics. Right? So she was already well known in economics, but say maybe she was under the radar for people who are not familiar with those fields, like subfields of economics.
Hmm. Yeah, and I recall, I think it was an Econ Talk episode from way back in 2009 when she won the prize, discussing her work and also the reactions to her winning, which from a lot of people, they were saying, I haven't heard of this person, who, it was kind of an unexpected win. And to their credit, a lot of the people saying, I haven't heard of this person, but I should have, which,
Yeah.
because her work is important and sort of touches on some of the foundational sort of assumptions in economics that have turned out to not really pan out. So that we tell every undergraduate
Right.
class about the tragedy of the commons, and her work shows just how many ways there are for people to get around that out in the real world.
Yeah, so that's the reaction is kind of interesting because it shows something about the structure of economics, as a field. So on one hand, we have these issues that say economists don't pay enough attention to other social scientists, but at the same time, we see that economists, even among economists, they are kind of shielded within their own subfield. So they don't pay that much attention to what's going on in other fields of economics. Right, so the people who were surprised is just people who were not familiar with public choice, with institutional economics, with environmental. So it's kind of interesting that economics is so partitioned even into these subfields that you can have a major figure from one of these subfields just being relatively unknown outside of that subfield.
If anything, that it shows the value of the Nobel as a way to make
Yeah,
people pay
exactly.
attention to other fields by when they get the Nobel, at least then people in the
Yeah.
other fields then pay attention.
I want to add something to what you said. So it's true that she did a lot of these field studies, and basically, a lot of her success is because of organizing this kind of field trips. So a lot of this research is done not by her personally, but by a large group of other people. And she basically was able to set up what's known as the workshop, right? So that started as an organization in Indiana, but now is basically this global, polycentric organization of many different centers all over the world who do research using the same kind of theoretical framework. So part of what she did was not just the empirical stuff, but the theoretical construction of the framework. Right? So the framework is known as the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. So the way she started is her and her collaborators, they were looking at existing studies of this kind of communal property management. And they looked at these studies from all over the social sciences, right? From anthropology, from sociology, from economics, from all over the place. And they had this issue that people in different fields were using different language to describe basically the same thing. So one of the things they did is to create this single language about how to talk about this kind of governance issues. So that's a major theoretical advancement, which is quite remarkable because they started by looking like hundreds of studies that were already done, and then they've done their own studies kind of to get a feel about what's involved in a field study, and that also helped them construct the theoretical framework better. And then, right, so there is this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which you can kind of make sense in a game theoretical framework, right? So if you describe, say, a prisoner's dilemma, and you think, okay, the tragedy of the commons can be formalized as a prisoner's dilemma, so then you can wonder, okay, how could you possibly escape the prisoner's dilemma logic that gives you that they should, all defect, at least in one-shot game. So she has, say, in Governing the Commons, like her most famous book about this topic, she actually addresses this theoretical topic in game theory, and she points out that, well, you should not assume that the payoff matrix in a game theory is fixed, right? So people play a game, they notice, oh, we're the emergent outcome is this thing that we don't like. So then they think, okay, what can we do to change the game, basically, right? So they create, say, rules that punish defectors or that reward cooperation, and that will change the payoffs of the game, right? So you can have, say, a prisoner's dilemma changed into a stag hunt by subsidizing cooperation and punishing defection. So then now you've changed the game into a game that has a cooperative equilibrium. So she also has this theoretical contribution to the whole field.
Yeah. So for context for listeners, that I'm sure listeners are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma. It's a game where both parties have a dominant strategy to defect, but they would be better off collectively if they didn't. The stag hunt, remind me, it's one where there actually is where there's a stable equilibrium where everyone cooperates.
Yeah, so the metaphor of the stag hunt is that, say, it's two of us and we go hunt a stag, but we could also defect and just go on our own and hunt a rabbit. So if I can only catch the stag if you cooperate with me. So if you do that, we catch the stag and we split it, and that's a lot of meat, much more meat than, say, just one rabbit.
Or two rabbits, right? So, if we each went for rabbits.
Yeah, it's just two rabbits. So the payoff for cooperation is higher, but it's also higher than the payoff that you get if you defect, right? So if you defect, you just get the rabbit, but you would have been personally better off if you cooperated and we got the stag. So that's the difference from the prisoner's dilemma, where in the prisoner's dilemma, if you defect, you get something better than if you cooperate personally.
Yeah, and you can, and mathematically you can convert a prisoner's dilemma to a stag hunt by just lowering the payoffs of defection to the point where
exactly
now if both people are cooperating, then that is a Nash equilibrium. Then defecting in that case would be worse than continuing to cooperate.
Yeah, and in practice, people create rules that will indeed punish defection. So they are changing the game to a more cooperative game like the stag hunt. So if you just think, oh, we give people these payoffs and they're stuck with those payoffs, then you're going to get a very distorted picture of how people actually cooperate.
Mm-hmm. So how did they go about taking this new set of theories and applying it and studying it in the field? What are some examples of the sort of field work that Ostrom and the people working in her research area did?
So they've studied a lot of different types of communal property. So, for example, fishing, right? So with fishing, you can have this overfishing problem. But then they've also say studied forests, and at first glance, the forest sounds more like a private good that you can just split the forest into private properties. But they discovered that forests are actually way more complicated than that, because the service that a forest is creating is not just wood, but they create say all sorts of these communal goods, like say flood protection, or they have this kind of they say you have animals inside the wood that roam around, right? So the forest is actually much more complicated than you would think at first glance. So it also that kind of explains why forests are often managed collectively in many places around the world. So basically, what they've done is look at different types of collective goods. Right near the end, she also looked at say global warming. Right, so that's kind of another type of collective good that's very challenging because it involves cooperation on such a large scale. So they looked at different types of communal goods, and they looked at different places around the world of how these communal goods were managed or mismanaged. So the purpose of this research was to try to figure out under what conditions can you expect a community to escape the tragedy of the commons. So at the first level, you could say, okay, if they have these rules, there's kind of a list of rules that you should have in order to successfully escape a tragedy of the commons, then say the community is successful. But then they go one level up and they ask, okay, why is it that some communities manage to create those rules while other communities don't? Right? So this is getting into public choice, where it's like, how do you create the rules? Right? So now we're talking about how people interact in order to create rules, rather than just looking at what kind of rules you should have or shouldn't have.
Mm.
Right? So basically, the research is going in this layered fashion. First, you're looking at what kind of explicit rules about the property you should or shouldn't have. Then you're going this upper level where you're asking, okay, what kind of rules of collective decision making these communities should have in order for them to create the proper rules about managing the property. And then you can kind of even go what they call the constitutional level. How do you create the collective choice rules? So now, why do you need to go to this upper level? So one thing that they discovered was that the same kind of good is managed successfully in very different ways around the world. Okay, so there are often small details that matter a lot. Right, so that makes it very hard from, say, importing a successful institution from one place to another place. Right, so you have, say, a successfully managed forest in Switzerland, and you want to import that, say, in Romania, where they don't manage forests properly. Right, so that's harder than you think at first glance, because there are all sorts of small details that turn out to matter a lot. So because of this, you cannot just import the successful rules from one place to another. You have to have the good rules created endogenously in each place. So that's how you have to go into this public choice question. Okay, how do you create those rules? Which communities have better collective choice mechanisms that will allow them to solve whatever problems they have better? Right? So this is kind of follows from the empirical field studies when you just discover the diversity of rules that are successfully managing communal properties, and then you wonder why is it that you have this diversity. Right? So once you realize this diversity is inescapable, then you need to focus on the processes of creating the rules rather than on what the rules are. Right? So then it's basically you kind of know what kind of rules you should have, but you never know, if you just go in some place you know nothing about, you know what kind of things they should have, but not specifically what rules they should have to actually achieve those purposes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it does, and it's really interesting how it sort of in the sort of during the Cold War, there was the Washington Consensus, the idea that that we'd figure out the best rules and then impose them everywhere, and that would be the recipe for development across the world, and
Right.
the focus on, I mean, and then the other side of the Cold War was going to turn everyone to socialism, and and they also had their sort of, they were both sort of an outside imposition of a certain kind of institution, and this is sort of a diverging view of development where like the local things need to happen at the local level, but there still might be a role for outside influence in maybe helping to set good meta level rules about how decisions are going to be made.
Yeah, so some of my research is actually kind of reevaluating the post communist transition policies. And what's interesting there is the lack of attention to things that we now think are obviously they should have paid attention to, like, say, corruption, or democracy. So if you look at the early papers on that were kind of advising how you should have a post communist transition, they just don't talk that much about, you should have a proper judicial system, you address corruption, you should have democracy, and basically all these collective choice mechanisms are ignored, and they just focus on the lower level rules, and that's turned out to be kind of a mistake.
So we've talked about the local governance aspect, especially with regards to governing the commons, forests, fisheries, etc. But
Yep.
so Ostrom also studied local policing. Do you want to speak to that? That's sort of an interesting research area.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So what happened is the first time she got PhD students at Indiana, she was kind of sick of water governance, and she told her students, you know what, choose any topic you want except water governance. There's too much water governance. So they chose this to study police, and that also led to this expanded research on public administration, which connects with the Vincent Ostrom's research on public administration. So basically, so to give you the context, so when he was at UCLA, so Vincent Ostrom and Thibault and Warren, they get this project to study public administration in metropolitan areas. So the idea at the time was that metropolitan areas are too decentralized. So you need to consolidate the public administration in metropolitan areas. So what happened was that we had these small towns that they grew, and basically now they touch each other. So now you have a giant metropolitan areas, but you have the legacy governance from when you had the small towns. So the thinking was, well, we should now get rid of this legacy public administration and create the consolidated metropolitan administration. So they got this project funded, study metropolitan organization, and the people funding this, they were like super unhappy with the Ostrom and Thibault and Warren, because they reached the opposite conclusion that actually it was better to have these decentralized metropolitan areas. So basically, there was like this massive conflict because of this, and Vincent Ostrom moves to Indiana. Elinor Ostrom comes with him at Indiana. They finally start up the workshop, and now they go back to this research on metropolitan area, and they're thinking, okay, you have this early 60s argument that Vincent Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren made, that metropolitan areas, it's not a problem that they are decentralized. They're trying to address this empirically. So they look at police departments, and they start by comparing consolidated police departments in Indianapolis versus the some suburbs that are still having the decentralized police departments. So basically, they're looking, okay, which perform better. Right? So, okay, how do you measure the performance of a police department? So one thing they discover is that the police departments themselves were not really evaluating their own performance properly. They were basically only looking at kind of inputs. Right? They're like, okay, how many people did we arrest? Stuff like that. So instead of relying on that, they basically look at the satisfaction that citizens have with police departments in various areas. So they compare the satisfaction that citizens have, and you can have all sorts of different kind of measures of satisfaction, or you can ask all sorts of questions. So they basically discover, yeah, people were far more satisfied in the decentralized, smaller police departments. And the reason turns out, right, so they actually go and ride with the police and try to see, okay, how are these departments actually organized? So they discovered that the reason why the smaller departments were functioning better was that basically in the larger departments, you had too many people working in the management rather than actually, say, patrolling the streets. Right? So if you have a large department, it's harder to manage. So you have all these layers of administration inside the department that just tries to manage the whole thing. So as a result, you end up with fewer people actually performing police services. So that's kind of the main reason, I think, why the smaller departments were more successful. And now so this was done in the early 70s. So now in the early 90s, they return to this and do this whole thing all over again. And they discover that the satisfaction with the police goes down across the board, but in the consolidated areas, it declines even more. Right? So there's like a trend of dissatisfaction with police, but this trend is more pronounced in the places where it was centralized. So this was first done like in a relatively small scale, and then they expanded the study to almost all the metropolitan areas in the U.S. So I think it's still the largest study of police departments in United States. And they basically found the same conclusion that consolidation was generally not a good idea. And they also then found all sorts of interesting details. So, for instance, people who were advocating to consolidate these departments, they had mistaken ideas about what was actually going on. So the main idea was that small police departments would overlap their activities. Right? So basically, they would waste resources by doing the same thing. Uh, and they were also thinking, okay, there are economies of scale with respect to some things. So, for example, a small police department shouldn't have its own jail because there's just not enough people. There's an economy of scale in having a single jail that services many police departments, okay? Or say a science lab that does the forensic. Right? It's not a good idea to have each small police department with its own lab. So kind of the assumption was that if you have these decentralized police departments, you're going to have all this waste because they don't take advantage of economies of scale. They're going to duplicate their efforts with respect to this, trying to do the same things and so on. So when they studied these departments all over the country, they discovered these were just wrong assumptions. So this is kind of where the polycentricity idea fits in. That these smaller police departments, they were actually cooperating to take advantage of economies of scale. They were cooperating to avoid the overlap, and you had basically this bottom-up cooperation between smaller police departments. Right. So, for example, if it's indeed the case that a forensic lab, is better to service many police departments, you actually see that emerging, right? Because the police departments, the localized police departments, they recognize that it would be a waste of their resources to try to set up their own police lab. But then they just contract with a police lab that services many police departments. So the actual organization of police departments is very interesting and very complicated. It's not a simple hierarchical structure. It depends on the specific type of issue. Like, are you talking about forensics? Are you talking about jail? Are you talking about patrol? Are you talking about training police officers? That's also not done locally, but in a more centralized fashion, and so on. So they basically discovered that the assumptions that people advocating for consolidation were using were just completely off, right? So then it becomes less surprising that the smaller police departments were actually outperforming the more consolidated police department.
Hmm. Yeah. So there was sort of an assumption that not consolidating, having these separate smaller departments kind of meant they were hermetically sealed and not communicating with each other. But of course, anything, or at least these economies of scale things like having shared jail or a shared laboratory are things that they could do through agreement. They can make, the three or four police departments covering one metropolitan area could make an agreement
Exactly.
to share one lab, and it's just not that hard for a small number of groups to come to some kind of agreement that saves them a lot on costs and makes them more effective.
Right. And there's an additional element here, namely that because this isn't a hierarchical system, you could have, say, competing labs, right, or competing training facilities. Right. So this happens, like, say, you're a police department and you want to hire new police, and you see that the police that used to come from this training facility or university, they're not very good. But then you have this other option, right? Or the same can happen with labs, right? So you also have this kind of element of competition between service providers, although this is not a private market, right? So you have this element of competition which helps with the quality concerns and the cost concerns. So that's something that Vincent Ostrom, Thibault, right? Thibault is the guy who has this whole model about voting with your feet, right? So this is kind of similar idea that you can have competition between public facilities, and that would kind of include this kind of market-like phenomenon, which will have good consequences. Right, so it's important that it's not a hierarchical system, both because it allows uh, this kind of bottom-up emergence of larger scale organization that differs from issue to issue. Right, so it could be that the economies of scale for jails are different than for forensic labs. So then you don't want to just have the higher level that does both science labs and jails. Right? You want them to be separate entities. And then if you have this possible competition between, say, different science labs or different training facilities, then you also have this additional benefit. While if it's just a hierarchical system, you're stuck with whatever service the higher level administration is providing.
Mm-hmm. and that higher level, as you mentioned, is many the management of it is many steps removed from the actual service you're providing. So in a small police department, the police chief himself is not going to be out on the street, doing just doing regular police work, but he probably talks to people who are who have direct experience of the areas they're policing. Whereas if you have someone who's trying to manage a police organization that covers a huge city with 1 million people in it, and he's essentially now he's like the CEO of a big company. He's got many layers of administrators and managers between him and the actual service they're providing. So if
Exactly.
there aren't good feedback mechanisms, or if there's some, it becomes a game of telephone from what your average beat cop is experiencing, and what the chief of police of some large metropolitan area actually hears and understands about the local needs.
Yeah, there's also, so related to all this issue is the issue of where does the funding come from. It's quite interesting to read some of these papers from the 70s and compare them to the present situation. So for instance, they have a paper about the problems in Chicago that say black people face from the police. Right? And now you have, there was like last year, I think, that Chicago report. And it's super interesting to compare that with this early paper by Ostrom, because they're highlighting the same kind of problems, like with police brutality, racism, and so on. But the problem now is much worse than it was then, right? So there are these kind of problems that have gotten worse. So the question is why? And those papers are interesting because they are assessing possible solutions to the problem, and they're kind of looking at different proposals and kind of assessing them. And they suggest that the best alternative is what they call community policing. And then they say, hey, this community policing idea could be massively misinterpreted and misused. So please don't do that. And when you go in the present, you see that on one hand, those proposals that they were criticizing, they were right in their criticism. And then the whole community policing idea was distorted exactly in the way in which they were saying, hey, be careful not to distort this idea that way. So some of these proposals that they discuss. So, for example, they look at funding, right? So one idea is, okay, police would do better work if they had more money. So they dismissed this idea because they observed that police departments that had the most money were also the worst performing. Right? So the problem was not the lack of resources, but it was how you would respond to the people you're policing. And so that connection between what the people actually want from police and what the police is actually doing, that connection is faulty in many places. So just giving more money to failing police departments, that's not going to solve the problem. Then they're looking at, say, this proposal to professionalize the police force, right? Basically, do better training, right? They're kind of dismissing of that because it's not addressing the structural incentive problem, right? So if you have more professional police, but the incentives they have to pay attention to the population are still not there, it's not going to help that much. So what they're saying is the way to that will fix these problems, at least to some extent, would be this kind of idea of community policing. So the idea is that the police should pay attention to the problems that the community has and then do their best to solve those problems. And they're saying this idea could be grossly misinterpreted if you just have the police, say, have these meetings with the community just in order to get information from the community, but then all the funding comes from the outside. And basically, the purposes that the police have are coming from the outside. So, the way in which Ostrom thought about community policing is that the police would get their purpose from the community, right? Not just information about who is where. So it turns out that the police so this idea of community policing kind of took off, right? Especially the label. So the police were trying to do these meetings, but they didn't really work out, and people stopped coming to those meetings because they realized, they're not really interested in what our concerns are. They're just trying to get whatever information from us. So a major problem with this is related to funding, right? So the reason why the police departments don't pay attention to the concerns of the local community is because they get most of their funding and resources from higher levels, right, including the
Mm.
federal level. Right, so the war on drugs is like a huge deal there because you have this purpose given from the federal government to all the way to local police, right? So they get a lot of resources if they fulfill this purpose that's given from them. Right. The other thing is the militarization of the police, right? So they get a lot of this equipment from the army, right? So you have to do things that satisfies whatever the federal government thinks in order to get these resources, and they love these resources. So basically, the community cannot compete with this interference from the federal level. Right, so that's kind of what they were saying in the 70s. Be careful not to go on this path because it's going to make things worse. Now, when you compare Chicago, which that was their focus as well, and you see this worsening of the situation, it's quite remarkable.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite unfortunate. And we kind of hope for a better solution, but the war on drugs is ongoing, and a lot of these problems uh, have not been solved, or have gotten
Yeah.
worse since this research was done. You kind of hope that somebody does all this great research, and it results in a significant improvement in the way things are, but these things take a lot of time.
Yeah, and with this kind of thing, you can see kind of the public choice element in their research, right? They're always looking at, okay, what are the incentives involved? What do people know about how to solve problems, right? So that's how they address all these issues. So it's a very economic way of looking at governance.
Hmm. Yeah. I kind of want to tie back to do you want to so we're discussing your book on Elinor Ostrom. Do you want to also mention your new book on institutional economics? Your I
Yeah,
believe it was it recently released or soon to be released?
yeah. So it's now you can pre-order it. So the title is
Okay.
Public Governance and the Classical Liberal Perspective. So it's co-authored with Dragos Alijica and Pete Petke. So we basically expand on this kind of approach, kind of a public choice approach to public administration, and kind of try to give a framework of how to think about public administration. So it builds a lot on this work by Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom, and also brings a lot of stuff from Buchanan and from Hayek. So it's kind of a combination of these elements of how you think about kind of the incentives that people have and the knowledge they have to solve it. How do you put this together? And yeah, so it, and it has this kind. So what we're doing in that book is we started the book thinking, okay, public administration as a field of study would gain a lot from paying more attention to Vincent Ostrom, to Buchanan, to Hayek, and that's still true. But we also discovered in the process of writing this that there's a lot of research within public administration, like regular public administration, which kind of moves in the direction that we're pushing for. So that was very interesting. So it's basically the practical challenges that public administration faced, bringing the entire field of public administration to pay more attention to these ideas of decentralized governance and these market-like interactions within the public domain, and also kind of the challenges that come with that, right? So, for instance, we're kind of critical of private-public partnerships because those do not fix the main incentive and knowledge problems, right? So, simply because you let a manager to be a private firm, that doesn't make it more successful, right, or more responsive to citizens' needs, right? What matters is the connection to the citizens' needs there, right? Is the institution to actually gather the information about citizens' needs and the incentive to use that information properly there, right? So simply having a firm manage something doesn't achieve that if the money comes from a central government, if you have these kind of partnerships that don't necessarily involve citizens. So the same kind of idea that you see in Elinor Ostrom's and their colleagues' work on police, you can generalize that to many other aspects of public administration. Right? The same kind of issues occur everywhere. Right? So it's not just the police that has this complex structure. That idea about the kind of failures of hierarchical organization, that's also a general idea, right? It applies to every issue of public governance. So the question then is, can we have a coherent picture of public governance, in general? Right? So that's kind of what we're trying to do in the public governance book.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's good to see that when we're discussing the Ostrom's work. Elinor Ostrom died in 2012, and then and actually so did Vincent Ostrom.
Yeah.
Just shortly after she did. But it's good to see that there's still this ongoing work in this area, and that it's still an active area of research, and not just a sort of historical curiosity, which is which only happens when a research field is dead. That it becomes something that just people talk about in the history books, but not actively work in. I want to comment on the public-private partnerships. It seems like a lot of I'm often very suspicious of them because they have the power of the state. It can use to say establish a monopoly or kind of they wield the power of the state, but then they don't have the restriction of
exactly
being a public body that can't earn a huge profit and then pocket it. So it seems like kind of the without the elements that we actually the competitive elements, the fact that it's nominally private doesn't really change a lot.
Yeah, so about the research, the ongoing research, so this is one of the most impressive things that Elinor Ostrom achieved, that it's not just their thing at Indiana, right? They basically set up this global research agenda that has been taken on by an enormous number of people. So this year in June it's called Workshop on the Workshop, and it's the 6th one. And there's this giant conference of all the kind of Ostrom-related research that comes to Bloomington, and this conference happens every 5 years. It's really spectacular conference, and you see this kind of ongoing research from all over the world in a wide range of issues that kind of all started with this attempt to create that institutional analysis and development framework, right? To have this kind of single language to talk about the issues. So it's most definitely an ongoing research program.
Mm-hmm. We're getting to the end of our time here. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of takeaways you want the audience to take from this conversation?
Yeah, so I guess one of the most important ideas that Elinor Ostrom put forth is this idea, or promoted, is this idea of polycentricity, right? So her Nobel Prize address is about polycentricity, and the concept has this interesting history that goes back to the 1950s to Michael Polanyi. So in the 1950s, there was this push to kind of centralize science in Great Britain. So their arguments were very similar to what I was saying about the public administration of metropolitan areas. They were saying, look, we have all these different scientists; they're overlapping their efforts. Right? Wouldn't it be more efficient if we just had a single centralized scientific community? So Michael Polanyi was, shocked by all this thing and tried to have an argument about why that would be a terrible idea to organize science that way. So he was building on the work on the socialist calculation debate. So, right, which was the same kind of debate about, you could replace markets with the government ownership. And the arguments there were the same, that the markets are overlapping their activities, right? You have, how many car companies that create almost similar cars, why not just have a single car company do the same, right? So you had this kind of the same argument. It's repeated over and over again, right? So it first occurred in the socialist calculation debate. Then in the 50s, Michael Polanyi encounters this argument with respect to the organization of science. So he's trying to make a similar argument to the Mises Hayek anti-socialist argument. But Polanyi realizes that markets work because of the price system, while the scientific community, right, is organized in this decentralized fashion without a price. Right, so it's kind of he has to invent a more general concept, and he creates this idea of polycentricity in order to explain why it's a terrible idea to have a hierarchical science. Um, so the big innovation here is that now you have a way to think about emergent order without necessarily having prices as the mechanism for coordination. So now you have a more general concept of how to analyze emergent order. So then Vincent Ostrom takes on this concept from Polanyi and notes, well, we have the same idea, say, in a Thibault competition situation, right? So, or in a federal system, right? So he's taking this idea of polycentricity and kind of notes that it's a very general concept, and we could have, we should have a more rigorous concept of polycentricity. Market is one example, the scientific community is another example, you have federalism, another example of polycentricity. And then you have Elinor Ostrom, right, who finds this concept super useful when she's analyzing the tragedy of the commons. Then they find it super useful when they look at police departments, right? Basically, where they look, like the successful systems are generally polycentric rather than hierarchical. So it's a very interesting concept, and the core idea of this concept is that it's a way to think of about emergent orders even when you don't have a price system as the coordination mechanism, right? So then it's a true dilemma. How does coordination happen? Right? So something like a scientific community is a very large community. How do they organize? Okay? Or like a federal system similar. So the key point here is that the organization or the coordination happens if they manage to create and enforce the proper rules. Right? So this is where Elinor Ostrom main research is. It's like checking out what kind of rules do you need for this polycentric organization to be successful, and what kind of social choice mechanisms allow a community to actually create those rules, right? So she studies failed communities and successful communities and tries to compare them both in terms of what kind of rules they have and in terms of the social choice mechanisms they have, right? So, the idea of polycentricity is kind of a key concept that goes across all these areas of research where she was involved in. And I think it's indeed a very, very important concept because it generalizes the idea of coordination beyond the case where you have a market, you have a price system, as to create that coordination. So it's a much more difficult case when you don't have that price, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a really great concept and a great field of research that I look forward to, seeing where it continues to develop in the future.
Yeah, me too.
My guest today has been Vlad Tarko. Vlad, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you so much.
If you're enjoying the show, I encourage you to join Economics Detective on Facebook. That's a group, a private group. Join it. You have to answer a couple questions about yourself when you join. Don't worry, there are no wrong answers. And once you joined it, you can join in on discussions about some of the topics on the show. I'll sometimes post updates about behind the scenes things. And it's just a good way to connect with other people who listen to the show. So Economics Detective, it's a group on Facebook. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon.